such a good attendance today for what represents the last in this year's sequence of events at the club, and I can think of no one better able to bring it to a close than our present speaker, Dr. Tom Mole. Tom is presently a reader in English literature at the University of Edinburgh, having arrived here, I recollect, about 3 years ago, Tom? Was it? 3 years ago. And he's already made a very positive mark too as the new director of the Centre for the History of the Book there, which incidentally runs its own series of talks, the last one being given by no less than our own Louise Gardner, deciphering a rare medieval manuscript discovered in the university library. He's the author of the prize-winning monograph Byron's Romantic Celebrity, 2007, and the editor of Romanticism and Celebrity Culture, 2009, and of the Broadview Reader in Book History, 2014. His Broadview Introduction to Book History, co-written with Michel Levi, will appear next year. He's a member of the Advisory Committee for the Publication of the Modern Language Association of America, PMLA. The acronym is much easier to use than the full title, I think, and probably more recognisable as well. And before coming to Edinburgh, held appointments at the University of Bristol, the University of Glasgow, and McGill University in Montreal. In 2013, he was visiting fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Durham University, and in 2017 he'll hold the inaugural Linda H. Patterson Fellowship of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. His book, What the Victorians Made of Romanticism, will be published by Princeton University Press next year. His talk today for the Scott Club is called Scott in Stone, the Scott Monument in the Victorian Pantheon. The monument itself, constructed as a high point in Scott's popularity, is of course a familiar object to us here at the new club. Glance backward as you, slightly to the right when you enter the portals at the front, and there it is. The statue now irradiated by floodlight, Scott himself looking like a rather unusually pensive Roman emperor when I last saw it. Not too much glancing out of the window this evening though, and I had a look and you can't actually see the Scott Monument, which I thought you could, but you can't, looking out of the windows in this room, because we have serious issues in view. Tom's talk, in his own words, promises to address the history of the Scott Monument in relation to changing conceptions of the Pantheon in Victorian Britain and the emergence of a secular, distributed and liberal pantheon of memorials to past heroes throughout the 19th century. Dr. Tom Mole.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much to the club for inviting me to talk to you tonight. I feel doubly or even triply embarrassed to be standing in front of you today. Firstly, because I'm very well aware that talking about the Scott Monument to the Scott Club in the new club is a little bit like taking coals to Newcastle, and as you leave this evening you might simply stop by the Scott Monument and falsify perhaps some of the things that I'm about to say about it. I hope that won't happen, but it could. Secondly, I'm concerned because of Sir Walter looking over my shoulder here, and he looks so lifelike that I'm concerned he might tap me on the shoulder and correct me at some point. And thirdly, I'm a bit concerned that the projector here is going to turn the Scott Monument into the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So I hope you'll bear with all of these concerns as I share with you tonight some of the research that I've been doing into the history of the Scott Monument and some of my efforts to locate the Scott Monument in relation to a broader and shifting Victorian conception of what a pantheon should be, what kind of pantheon of monuments to past heroes Britain should have, and how the idea of the pantheon crucially changed, I think, in part as a result of the campaigns and the design and the construction of the Scott Monument. How that changed through the 19th century. From the agitation that preceded the Reform Bill of 1832 to the repercussions that followed that of 1885, Great Britain was engaged in an especially intense period of reflection on who constituted the nation and what they shared. And as I say that, I'm acutely conscious that Great Britain is once again engaged in such a period of reflection. Established badges of membership were not sufficient. The slow waning of the landed interest meant that membership of the nation could no longer be equated with ownership of its territory. Rapid imperial expansion meant that it could no longer be linked to residence in the metropole. And reform agitation meant that, in the full political sense, it could no longer be restricted to a governing elite. As a result, new forms of cultural consensus were urgently needed. Whether that consensus took the form of an imagined community mediated by print, as Benedict Anderson argues, or as a shared opposition to external threat across the Channel, as Linda Colley suggests, it required a set of common cultural references that was sufficiently cohesive to structure and identity, and yet sufficiently vague to allow diverse individuals to unite under a single flag. Only by promoting forms of cultural consensus that could be shared by both parties and all classes could the two nations that Disraeli surveyed in Sybil become one reformed whole. Creating a shared identity in the present depended often on constructing a shared past. Collective memory could be anchored in events, traditions, places, attributes, and crystallised in what the French theorist Pierre Nora calls lieux de mémoire, sites of memory. But the great man theory of history, elaborated most fully by Carlyle, of course, underpinned the common assumption that the consensus required was primarily one about individuals. A shared set of heroes, or a pantheon of great men, they were almost always men, would provide examples of civic virtue and artistic achievement for emulation. From the 1790s on, plans for national pantheonic structures were rife. Pantheons could be discursive, like Hazlitt's Spirit of the Age from 1825, sculptural, like those in Westminster Abbey and St Paul's Cathedral, or popular, like the waxworks in Madame Tussaud's collection and the busts that decorated the Pantheon Assembly Rooms in Oxford Street. Drawing up lists of individuals who counted from the past helped to produce a consensus about the nation's shared heritage during a period of intense uncertainty about who would be counted, literally counted at the ballot box in the present. Westminster Abbey seemed to be the most eligible location for a national pantheon in the early 19th century. In 1901, the American traveller John Stoddard wrote, "Westminster Abbey is England's pantheon of genius." In fact, this understanding of the Abbey as a pantheon was largely an 18th century invention. It was the result of a rapid succession of monuments installed in the second half of the century that created the pantheon that we know today, and in particular created Poets' Corner. The term Poets' Corner is not used about Westminster Abbey before the 19th century. It's true that Chaucer is buried there, but he was buried there because he was a government administrator, not because he was a poet. The idea that there's a Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey is a late 18th century invention. Scott was buried, as you all know, in the ruins of Dryburgh Abbey, according to his own preferences and amid much ceremony. But half a century would pass before he was admitted to the other abbey. In the 1880s, a private subscription was taken up in Edinburgh for the purpose of commemorating him at Westminster. That subscription raised enough money to commission a medallion of the poet, but in August 1888, the Dean of Westminster rejected it as unsuitable for the abbey. The snub. In 1896, the Dean, however, relented, I'm happy to say, after being petitioned by a number of eminent Scots, many of them in the House of Lords, and a copy of the bust of Scott by Sir Francis Chantry at Abbotsford was unveiled in Westminster Abbey on the 21st of May, 1897. Now, partly as a result of its slowness to admit Scott, as well as Byron, who didn't make it into Westminster Abbey until 1969, the Abbey began to seem increasingly unfit to serve as a truly national pantheon. From early in the 19th century, then, there were demands for an alternative, inclusive and secular pantheon. In an 1838 pamphlet, Henry Austin Driver asked, "Is it wise at all to pay worldly honours to worldly eminence in edifices consecrated to religious purposes?" The Bishop of Exeter, speaking in the House of Lords in 1844, wished for some national place, not a church, in which these monuments might be fitly placed. And in 1868, the Dean of Westminster himself lamented how extremely unequal and uncertain is the commemoration, or absence of commemoration, of our famous men. It is this which, he continued, makes the Abbey, after all, but an imperfect monument of greatness. So at the beginning of the 19th century, people are actively looking for an alternative pantheonic structure to replace Westminster Abbey or St Paul's Cathedral. Several alternatives were suggested. The founding of the National Gallery, 1824, National Portrait Gallery, 1856, Scottish National Gallery, 1859, and Scottish National Portrait Gallery, 1889, all offered prominent places to display images of notable individuals. The National Portrait Gallery in London acquired a portrait of Byron in 1862 and one of Scott in 1867. But the galleries had other functions to serve besides that of a pantheon. St Paul's Cathedral did begin to emerge as a military pantheon, following a number of installations of statues commemorating heroes of the Napoleonic Wars. But it was subject to continued misgivings about the propriety of celebrating military sacrifices in a house of worship consecrated to the supreme sacrifice of Christ. The desire to identify and commemorate great men as part of constructing a new national consensus began then with the search for alternative venues for a pantheon. But what I want to suggest is that it didn't end there, that in fact none of the contenders for a new pantheon gained universal approbation. The reluctance to accept any building as a suitable pantheon was partly the result of not wanting to follow the French too closely. But it also stemmed from the pantheon's function as a lieu de mémoire, an element in the construction of a reformed national consciousness. It was initially essential for such lieu de mémoire to be embedded in institutions with established authority for the ascription of cultural capital. But for the socio-cultural project of the Pantheon to be fully successful, commemorative acts had to move beyond the walls of their sponsoring institutions. When the Pantheon ceased to be a structure and became an idea, it demanded not to be built in a single location, but to be imagined stretching across the nation. Britain didn't acquire a secular pantheon in the 19th century, but the reason it didn't acquire a secular pantheon was because it became one. The distributed pantheon spread outwards from the twin centres of Edinburgh and London, whose streets, squares and parks slowly became more and more haunted by the mighty dead as the century went on. And this distributed pantheon offered new possibilities for constructing elective affinities, ley lines of connection between memorials that made the memorials add up to more than the sum of their parts. Edinburgh's urban space, as many of you know, had been undergoing a reconfiguration since James Craig's plans for the new town were adopted in 1767, inaugurating what Ian Duncan calls a 60-year boom of construction and civic improvement, fuelled by Edinburgh Town Council's combination of visionary enthusiasm and deficit spending. Familiar to some, familiar laughter, I can hear laughter of recognition. This is one of the most notable planned urban developments of the period before Haussmann's renovation of Paris. And the new town's streets and squares rendered Edinburgh an unmistakably modern Georgian city. The modernisation of Charlotte Square to a 1791 design by Robert Adam, the extensive improvements of Leith Docks, 1806 to 1817, the creation of Waterloo Place, just up the road, 1815 to 1819, and the construction of the Royal Institution on Princes Street, to a design by William Playfair, 1822 to 26, these were emblems of the city's self-confidence and of its modernity. As Duncan argues, this rapid development of the city's physical environment was accompanied by a rethinking of Edinburgh's distinctive identity. No longer universally acknowledged as a commercial, political, or intellectual powerhouse, as it had been at the end of the 18th century, the city evolved a new identity, centred in part on its natural beauty and its literary heritage. Beginning with George IV's visit in 1822, largely staged, of course, by Scott, the city promoted itself as what Duncan calls a new kind of national capital, not a political or commercial metropolis, but a cultural and aesthetic one. This is very much an image of Edinburgh that we are still living with. The central railway station was called Waverley from the middle of the 19th century. The physical renovation of Edinburgh and its imaginative recreation came together in an extraordinary range of plans for new public memorials to distinguished individuals. Monuments were erected to Robert Burns on Regent Road, 1831, to Prince Albert in Charlotte Square, 1876, but the city's principal monuments were arranged along an axis right here, from Carlton Hill through Waterloo Place to Princes Street Gardens. The Nelson Monument was constructed on Carlton Hill between 1807 and 1815, modified in 1853, where it was joined in 1822 by the National Monument to commemorate the Scottish contribution to the Napoleonic Wars, and in 1831 by the Monument to Dugald Stewart. The axis was extended westwards by the Scott Monument, 1840 to 46, the equestrian statue of the Duke of Wellington outside Register House in Waterloo Place, 1852, and the paired statues of John Wilson and Alan Ramsay in Princes Street Gardens, both 1865. At a time when, in Benedict Reed's words, sculpture could be said to have ranked virtually as an industry, both London and Edinburgh developed significant clusters of commemorative sculpture, formed into pantheons which were not enshrined in a single structure, but distributed across newly developed geographies of urban space. The earliest proposals to commemorate Scott envisaged creating a new pantheon built around him. Just a month after Scott's death, a letter to the Caledonian Mercury proposed completing the National Monument. It was a source of lasting shame that the National Monument had run out of money halfway through and not been completed. So this letter writer suggests completing the National Monument and turning it into a kind of Scottish pantheon with Scott at its centre. Let us suppose, sir, this noble building completed, the interior consisting of a vast hall, in the centre, or at one end of which, a colossal statue of the poet to be placed, with no inscription marking the edifice as peculiarly dedicated to him as its great presiding spirit. I should then propose that along each side there should be pedestals or niches for the distinguished men of Scotland from the earliest period of history down to the most remote futurity. The one wall should contain the busts or statues, or where no resemblance remained, the names at least, or some characteristic emblem of the Scottish worthies previous to Sir Walter's death. The other side should have similar receptacles prepared for those which are to follow, down to the latest posterity. In this splendid array of the virtues and talents of the nation, the poet would seem as the great magician who had conjured them up around him. Scott is recruited here not simply as a member of the new pantheon, but as its great presiding spirit, who brings the pantheon into existence by conjuring it. Conceived in the year of the First Reform Act, this proposal is self-consciously forward-looking. It gathers the great men of the past, but also makes room for the new heroes that the reformed nation will produce. At the head of the pantheon, Scott is also a pivotal historical figure, the fulcrum of Scotland's modernity, with the past on one side and the future on the other. The fact that this proposal was abandoned in favour of the monument to Scott that was built is evidence of a shift in conceptions of the pantheon in the age of reform, as it moved away from being a single structure to being a network of distributed monuments, and also as it moved away from being a Scottish concern and towards a British one. Pierre Nora, who came up with the idea of lieu de mémoire, asserts that statues or monuments to the dead owe their meaning to their intrinsic existence, even though their location is far from arbitrary. One could justify relocating them without altering their meaning. Well, this is definitely not true in the case of the Scott Monument. I don't think it's generally true. The monument site was certainly not chosen for its convenience, and the effort expended to place it there reveals how significant the choice was. A special Act of Parliament was required to permit the monument's construction, because Princes Street Gardens was protected from new building works by a previous act. Sir William Rae, lifelong friend of Scott, MP for Bute and member of the Privy Council, introduced a private members' bill for the purpose on the 15th of March 1841, which swiftly passed into law. Several months of work and great expense were then necessary to construct what the monument's official history called an underground structure of the most substantial masonry that would raise the site 52 feet to the level of Princes Street and provide an adequate foundation. And you can see in this photograph from the time taken by Hill and Adamson just how extensive the work required to bring the base of the monument up to the level where it could be built was. So it was hard work to secure the site in Princes Street and to make it suitable to receive the monument. But it was worth it, because that placed Scott at the crux of Edinburgh's Pantheon in progress. Rising above Princes Street, the Scott Monument answered the Nelson Monument and the National Monument, both on Carlton Hill to the east. It shared the Nelson Monument's towering, tapering shape and was clearly visible from it, positioning Scott as a literary hero on a par with Britain's military hero. It also had the National Monument in its sights, placing a celebration of Scott's contribution to Britain's literary heritage opposite a celebration of Scotland's contribution to Britain's military supremacy. The Burns Monument, installed in 1831 on Regent Road to the south of Carlton Hill, was close to this axis, but obliquely situated in relation to it. As time went on, the pantheonic axis that connected these monuments would be consolidated and extended by three other memorials, designed by John Steele, who sculpted Scott's statue. Wellington, 1852, to the east of Scott, and Wilson and Ramsay, 1865, to the west. I've been told, and some of you have probably heard, that Wellington's statue was popularly known as the Iron Duke in bronze by Steele. So taken together, these monuments were at the centre of an Edinburgh Pantheon, a string of memorials less than a mile apart, which celebrated the role of Scottish cultural and military heroes in ensuring Britain's preeminence. I'm suggesting that this kind of pantheon was liberal, that it had to be, to work in the age of reform, to build the cultural consensus that I'm attributing to it, it had to be sufficiently liberal to accommodate people with drastically different views. And that idea was tested by a politically controversial addition to this pantheonic axis. The obelisk erected in Carlton Hill Burial Ground to commemorate the political martyrs deported on charges of treason in 1793-94. Its foundation stone was laid in August 1844 and it was completed in September 1845, making its construction contemporaneous with that of the Scott Monument. Like the Scott Monument, promoting its construction involved the coordinated activity of committees in Edinburgh and London, and it was funded by subscriptions collected since the early 1830s. The leading lights of the project were radicals such as the MP Joseph Hume, 1777 to 1855, and the publisher William Tate, 1793 to 1864. And they hoped to advance the cause of radical reform in the 1830s and 40s by celebrating a radical heritage. But despite the debate surrounding their proposals, the resulting monument was more a symptom of the moderate consensus the new Pantheon promoted than a focal point for renewed radicalism. The town council insisted on approving the design by Thomas Hamilton, which was unobjectionably plain. The monument's location did not allow it to become the site for political gatherings, because there was very limited space around it. The inscriptions on it avoided acrimony, simply naming the martyrs and quoting statements by two of the men, Thomas Muir and William Skirving, at their trials. The inscription, erected by the Friends of Parliamentary Reform in England and Scotland, was sufficiently vague to include both moderates who were satisfied with the reforms of 1832 and radicals who hoped for further concessions in the future. Inserted between the monuments on Carlton Hill and those in Princes Street Gardens, but set well back from the street that connected them, the obelisk took its place in an Edinburgh Pantheon that, considered as a whole, promised to dissolve political differences and promote national consensus. The Scott Monument contributed to a pantheon in Edinburgh that promoted cultural consensus then, but it also constituted a micro-pantheon in its own right. The structure included likenesses of 16 Scottish writers positioned around the statue of Scott. The selection was significant. It was weighted towards the previous century and included James Hogg, Robert Burns and James Beattie. But it placed those writers within a Scottish literary tradition extending back to the early modern period, represented by likenesses of William Drummond of Hawthornden, King James I and Queen Mary, both monarchs featured here as Scottish authors rather than rulers. So that tradition appeared as distinctly Scottish in character, but the inclusion of Lord Byron, Tobias Smollett and James Thomson among the statuettes was a reminder that it overlapped with a literary tradition more often and ambiguously identified as English. These 16 Scottish authors were in turn surrounded by 64 niches for small statues, half of which had been filled by the 1870s with fictional characters and historical individuals who featured in Scott's works. This feature of the monument represented Scott's works as themselves a kind of pantheon of great historical figures and memorable characters, and promoted character-based reading as the appropriate way of approaching them. As well as being a micro-pantheon, the Scott Monument was also a microcosm of the city of Edinburgh. Situated on the dividing line between the Old Town and the New Town, it incorporated elements of both. William Watson grasped the significance of this in his sonnet on the Scott Monument. He noted that it was located in this highway proud that arrow straight cleaves at one stroke the new world from the old. On this side, commerce, fashion, progress, gold. On that, the castle hill, the Canongate. The monument's Gothic architectural structure recalled the twisty medieval Old Town, as well as the ruined medieval abbeys on which George Kemp explicitly based its design. The marble statue at the monument's centre, on the other hand, recalled the neoclassical Georgian style of the New Town. The Times complained that the pedestal does not partake of the character of the building and gives rather an incongruous effect to the whole. But this missed the point. The monument's combination of seemingly incongruous elements was actually part of its import in the Age of Reform, combining a marble statue in the aristocratic neoclassical style with a canopy in the Gothic style that was associated with democracy. It modelled the unity in diversity of the reformed nation. John Ruskin had praised Gothic ornament as revolutionary because it celebrated the imperfect efforts of individual workmen and proceeded from what Ruskin called a healthy love of change. Ruskin might have been describing the reform agitation when he characterised the Gothic temper as founded on strength of will, independence of character, resoluteness of purpose, impatience of undue control, and that general tendency to set the individual reason against authority and the individual deed against destiny. The Scott Monument thus enshrined in stone the tolerance of difference that the reformed nation would require. Watson did not approve. "Oh, Scotland, was it well and meetly done?" he asked. But he did recognise that unifying these different elements was a progressive gesture. For see, he sits with back turned on the past. Invoking the ancient lower-class Old Town and the modern upper-class New Town, the Scott Monument attempted to combine them both into a single whole, while facing towards a future in which their inhabitants might coexist as equal members of the reformed nation. The significance of this unifying project extended far beyond Edinburgh. As well as being a micro-pantheon, a fixture in the Edinburgh Pantheon, and a focal point for the city, The Scott Monument was also located in a force field that extended across Britain and before long beyond. Think of the copy of the statue in Central Park in New York. From the start, the monument was represented not simply as an undertaking for Edinburgh or for Scotland, but one for a reformed and unified British nation. At the ceremony to lay the foundation stone in 1840, a military band played Rule Britannia and God Save the Queen. As part of the ceremony, a glass jar containing coins of the realm showing George IV, William IV and Victoria was placed in the monument's foundations. And when the structure was completed in October 1844, 2 years before the statue was installed, a Union Jack was flown from the top to mark the event. These gestures helped to create the impression that commemorating Scott was not just a Scottish duty, but a British one. Flying the Union Jack over the Scott Monument seemed appropriate in 1844 because of a sustained campaign in the previous 12 years since Scott's death to represent him as a national treasure and his monument as an exemplary undertaking for the reformed nation. Raising funds, gathering subscriptions, and organising competitions for the design of the monument and its statue involved the coordinated action of committees in Edinburgh, London, and Glasgow. When the funds raised threatened to fall short of what was required, the Times reinforced the point that this was the business of the whole nation. The newspaper acclaimed this truly national work and admonished its readers to take an interest. We cannot conceive of a greater humiliation to any nation than the fact that a monument to such a man should remain unfinished. This claim to respect and distinction should not be confined either to the city or to the land of his birth. The only limit we would propose would be that the sum required should be raised by subscription from those only who have derived pleasure and instruction from his works. So you can see that in 1844, it looked dangerously like the Scott Monument was going to be another fiasco like the National Monument had been, left half finished in the middle of the city. But the paper's vocabulary tellingly slips here between the land that bore Scott and the nation that is now duty-bound to commemorate him, suggesting that the land of Scott's inspiration is nested within the nation that justly claims his works as its own. For a work to be truly national in the era of reform required it to mobilise different social classes. The project of commemorating Scott did so effectively, from royalty downwards, offering a form of cultural consensus that could model and promote a new kind of political consensus. The committees were able to attract the patronage of two monarchs. William IV contributed £300 to the initial subscription, and when it looked like that wasn't going to be enough, Victoria and Albert answered a subsequent appeal for funds by subscribing £100 and £25 respectively. The initial meetings held in various parts of the kingdom to discuss the monument for Scott were, according to the official committee, the official history, were addressed by the most distinguished noblemen and gentlemen, and the acting committee of 15 boasted 4 knighthoods between them. So initially this was elite business. But when funds fell short, an auxiliary committee consisting of 300 of the chief merchants and other influential townspeople of Edinburgh and Leith was formed to raise subscriptions. And by the time the foundation stone was laid, according to the monument's official history, all classes were vying with each other in expressions of sympathy in the grand national movement to commemorate Scott. The committees adapted their fundraising to different classes, from the Waverley balls held for the wealthy and fashionable in London in July 1844 and in Edinburgh in April 1844 and again the following year, to the house-to-house visitation undertaken by the auxiliary committee among those of more modest means. The Scott Monument was represented as a shared enterprise in which everybody could take part. The monarch, the nobility, the gentry, the beau monde, the middle mercantile sort, and finally, all classes. In the years immediately following the First Reform Act, participating in the commemoration of Scott was a way of sharing in a unified but stratified national consciousness, engaging in the collaborative project of recognising a great man whom everyone admired within a pantheon on which everyone could agree. Two reassuringly meritocratic competitions, one for the design of the monument's architectural structure and the other for the statue, also brought together social classes without by any means negating their differences. The unknown lower-class George Michael Kemp won the first competition to design the structure, and the well-established John Steele, later Sir John, won the second. Queen Victoria had already sat to Steele for her bust, but Kemp, a shepherd's son from Lanarkshire, was a complete unknown. He appears in the monument's official history as an exemplary citizen of the reformed and newly meritocratic nation. Kemp had largely educated himself, working as a journeyman joiner in England and continental Europe, while honing his skill as an architectural draftsman by studying ruins and cathedrals. He's portrayed in the official history as a humble artist, not far removed from the position of an ordinary workman, who rebuts objections to his design from enemies and detractors in order to convince the committee and secure the commission. They said it wouldn't stand up. They said it was too fanciful. They said he didn't know enough about architecture. He rebuts these and wins the commission. At the laying of the foundation stone, Sir William Ray praised Kemp for being unassuming and meritorious and claimed him as a native artist. It didn't end well for Kemp, I have to tell you. On the foggy night of the 6th of March 1844, 7 months before the builders realised his design, Kemp fell into the Union Canal and drowned. The monument's history mourned him as a native genius cut down in his prime. His indefatigable industry and self-culture would earn him a place in Samuel Smiles's Self-Help, itself an alternative, purportedly meritocratic pantheon, where he is praised for being exceedingly taciturn and habitually modest, and for living as an ordinary mechanic whilst executing drawings which would have done credit to the best masters of the art. In this combination of talent, industry, and humility, sounds familiar, it's because in exhibiting those qualities, Kemp resembled the dominant posthumous image of Scott himself. Scott's obituary in the Times had praised his personal simplicity of character and total absence of literary affectation. And Lockhart's biography expanded this to present a massively detailed story of self-sacrifice following the financial collapse of his publishers and redemption through his enormous exertions to pay off his creditors at the expense of his health. Noticing the first volume of Lockhart's biography, the Times returned to this theme. Scott was perhaps not the first literary man of his age, the Times said, but he was at least one who had certainly the most healthy and wholesome mind among all the tribe. This was not faint praise of Scott, but an indication that a wholesome mind was worth more than a literary one. Thus framed, Scott could be accepted as a moral exemplar for the nation as a whole. Who can tell how many dormant spirits have been roused to arduous and successful exertion by the honourable example of Scott, remarked the Lord Provost at the ceremony to inaugurate the monument. The Lord Provost at the time was Adam Black, the publisher who would secure Scott's copyrights in 1851, and who would join the Edinburgh Pantheon himself when his statue was erected in Princes Street Gardens in 1877. In his remarks, Scott appears less as a literary genius and more as a commercial success. Rather than portraying Scott as the Wizard of the North, several posthumous commentators made him into a paragon of personal application, capable of inspiring men such as Kemp to the arduous and successful exertion required to succeed in modern capitalist society. Exhibiting the diligence in a worldly calling, which Samuel Smiles would enjoin in Self-Help and Max Weber would identify as key to the development of capitalism, Scott is made to model a form of conduct well adapted to the bourgeois industrial society of the 19th century. Equipped with authors who exhibited these virtues and with citizens who were prepared to emulate them, the reformed nation was ready not only to grow commercially, but also to expand imperially. Inaugurating the Scott Monument, the Provost won loud cheers when he said, "Continents as yet unexplored will be taught by the wisdom of Scott and enlivened by his wit, and rivers unknown to song will resound with the lays of his minstrelsy. But nowhere will his memory be cherished with fonder attachment and more enduring delight than in the cities and the hamlets of his own beloved Scotland. Loud cheers. Well, perhaps Black had one eye on the export revenues that Scott's copyrights would generate. But the undertones of his rhetoric are imperial as well as commercial. The Lord Provost here bears out Ian Duncan's claim that Romantic Edinburgh stands at the threshold of what we are used to reading as a Victorian story of world empire. Adapting the colonial logic of Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education, 1835, which advocated educating Indians in English about British culture to the exclusion of indigenous languages and cultures, he recruits Scott to a project of apparently benevolent imperialism. His references to continents as yet unexplored and rivers unknown to song invoke the exploration of Africa's interior along its rivers. Scott is thus yoked with a line of Scottish explorers who would soon join him in the British Pantheon. Mungo Park, who was commemorated with a statue in Selkirk in 1859, and David Livingstone, who was commemorated with a statue just yards from the Scott Monument in Princes Street Gardens in 1875. For the Scott Monument to do the cultural work that I'm attributing to it, it had to reach an audience beyond those who could visit it in Edinburgh. And it did this when it was reproduced in engravings and on silverware and using the new technologies of photography and chromolithography. The committee produced an engraving of the monument's design, which was given to anyone who subscribed a guinea or more, and when it was complete, the monument was engraved for the frontispiece of its official history. It also became the subject for some of the first photographs ever taken. These include one by William Henry Fox Talbot, inventor of the negative-positive process, who captured the monument for his second photographically illustrated book, Sun Pictures in Scotland, 1845, as well as a number by David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, who photographed the monument at every stage of its construction. What interests me about these photographs is they show no interest whatsoever in waiting until it was finished. They're really concerned to document not the finished monument, but the process of memorialisation that's going on. Fox Talbot also, as well as this picture of the Scott Monument, he also took a picture of Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square, and he didn't wait till that was finished either. He depicts it under construction with scaffolding around it, with the top of the column cut off by the frame of the picture. So there's a really interesting connection between early photography and this growth of this distributed pantheon in England that I've been talking about. The other connection I want to draw here that extends this circulation of the Scott Monument, that takes the Scott Monument, if you like, out of Edinburgh, is the picture postcard. The penny post, introduced in Britain in 1840, allowed anyone to send a letter anywhere in the country for only a penny in one of several posts each day. It produced a huge rise in the amount of material circulating through the mail and was accompanied by a variety of innovations in communications technology, like the postage stamp and the prepaid envelope. Postcards were introduced in 1870, so a little way after the Scott Monument. Initially, the only cards allowed to be sent through the post were those printed by the post office, which included the cost of postage in the purchase price. But from 1872, private firms were also allowed to produce postcards. And picture postcards first appear in 1894, making use of then cutting-edge technologies such as chromolithography. Photographic postcards weren't technically or commercially viable until the 20th century. Initially, the picture took up only part of the card, leaving space for the address on the other side. But from 1902, regulations changed, allowing pictures to cover the whole front surface of the card, with the back divided in the middle, providing space for the address on one side and the message on the other in the format that's familiar to us. So postcards caught on rapidly and sold in enormous numbers. By some estimates, 75 million postcards were sent in 1870, the first year of the postcard's existence in Britain, and that figure rose to a staggering 600 million postcards carried through the mail in 1903. The Victorians adopted the postcard so enthusiastically because it was cheap, efficient and modern, and also because it was connected to contemporary developments such as the rise of middle-class tourism, the increasing popularity of sending greetings cards on Valentine's Day or at Christmas, and the greater mobility of the labour force as people moved to find work. The firm of Raphael Tuck was one of the earliest and largest producers of picture postcards, with over 10,000 different cards in production by 1903. In 1900, Tuck organised a postcard collecting competition, with £1,000 in prizes for those individuals who collected the most cards that had been sent through the post. They had to go through the post, you couldn't just go and buy them. And this competition, I think, is interesting because it reveals the way that postcards were bound up both with economy of circulation and with an economy of accumulation, collecting. The winner had a collection of over 20,000 different cards. Now, it won't surprise you to know that the Scott Monument was a very popular subject for picture postcards. In fact, I've seen more than 20 different examples used by various publishers. Tuck produced at least 4 different images of the Scott Monument, usually as parts of sets of 6 postcard views of Edinburgh or Midlothian, each of which had a likely print run of several thousand. The Scott Monument also appeared in other kinds of Victorian collectible printed ephemera, such as cigarette cards. Cope Brothers Tobacco, for example, produced a set of 50 Scott-themed cards about 1900, including an image of the monument. The monument was completed 25 years before the postcard boom, so unlike photographers, postcard artists didn't depict it under construction. Instead, they represented it as a landmark achievement of a thriving modern city that was striding into the future without forgetting the past. A 1902 image in the Oilette series, a high-end line which Tuck described as veritable miniature oil paintings, shows the monument at the centre of a respectable and commercial city. In the foreground, figures stroll in well-kept public gardens filled with potted flowers. The glass skylights of the railway station that connects Edinburgh with the rest of the nation form a line leading the viewer's eye towards the Scott Monument. To the right of the monument, the commercial artery of Princes Street extends into the distance, bustling with new cable-hauled trams installed in the 1880s, first installed in the 1880s, horse-drawn delivery vehicles and private motor cars, and lit by municipal streetlights. Canvas awnings stretch over the windows of large shops, including Jenner's, rebuilt in 1895 after a fire, immediately opposite the Scott Monument. And behind the Scott Monument you can see the Royal Scottish Academy and Edinburgh Castle. Commerce, history and the arts come together in an image of a thriving modern city with Scott at its heart. By the second half of the century then, the movement to create a new pantheon for the reformed nation had ceased to be a search for a new structure. Instead, the new pantheon took shape as a loose collection of monuments, distributed across the nation's rapidly developing cityscapes and remediated in its shifting and innovative mediascapes. The Scott Monument was a key fixture of this new distributed pantheon. Its location placed it at the centre of the emerging Edinburgh Pantheon, located along the axis between the old town and the new. The campaign to build the monument was framed as an exemplary undertaking for a nation seeking new forms of cultural consensus. Its construction unified aesthetic styles associated with different social groups and combined elements designed by individuals from different ends of the social spectrum. Its fundraising campaign brought together several different social strata in a national project to which every sector of the reformed nation could contribute. It reached across the nation when it circulated through new media such as photography and featured in the postcard boom. And its supporters positioned Scott as a paragon of professional application and an ambassador for a modern commercial and imperial power. In all these ways, Scott was recruited to a project of creating a new secular pantheon for reformed Britain that took shape not as a grand new building, but as a network of monuments distributed across the nation. Functioning as a lieu de mémoire, unconfined by a particular location or medium, the Pantheon gave material existence in the present to a past shared by the newly enfranchised subjects of a reformed nation that not only had to legislate itself into existence, but also had to imagine itself into being. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was doubly interesting for me, and I'm sure everybody else here. It shed new light on something which is familiar to us, and it placed it in a much larger context of national memorialising It was a very full talk, but we have about 5 to 8 minutes available to us for questions. I'm sure people want to ask various things of Tom that came up. Alan.
I'd rather like to hear your views about the comparison between the Scott Monument and the Albert Memorial, which the same shape and both Gothic on the one hand, and I believe, I can't remember the source of it, but the criticism of the Scott Monument that the figure is too small, and particularly in comparison with the Albert Memorial, which I think also is a sort of pantheon, isn't it? It has at least science and technology and all these things around it.
That's right. It certainly is a sort of pantheon, and it's also, as I suggested, this is the case with the Scott Monument. It's also, in a way, a reflection of Victorian imperial consciousness, because it also has representations of other continents as well. And there's no doubt in my mind that there was some influence and perhaps even some element of twinning going on. If what I've suggested is true, that this distributed pantheon allowed for the creation of elective affinities and connections among monuments around the nation, then you can see the kind of advantage of twinning monuments in Edinburgh and London. And in the book, I also talk about a statue of Byron in London, which was produced, erected in the 1880s, and is now almost completely forgotten because it's still there, but it's at Hyde Park Corner, but it's on a traffic island that's almost impossible to get to, and so nobody pays any attention to it anymore. I risked my life to go and look at it up close. But more importantly, I discovered that statue was, at one point in the planning, it was planned to have a kind of ornate canopy over it that would have been very similar to the Scott Monument. The statue of Byron in Hyde Park is almost identical to the statue of Scott in the Scott Monument. They're both sitting on rocks, they both have dogs next to them, they both have open books. And so there are very clear kind of twinning things, and that would have been absolutely clear if they built the canopy that they intended. The reason they didn't was because a much larger canopy was designed for the Albert Memorial while they were in the process of raising money for the Byron statue. So I think that is a great example of the kinds of connections between monuments quite far apart in this distributed pantheon. And I think what's also interesting is it raises this possibility of another monument that would have achieved that twinning effect but actually didn't because of a change of plans.
You mentioned the fact that this begins in the 19th century and there are various social, political reasons for this tradition of creating memorials for people. But was there an instance anywhere like what was done for Scott relating to an author beforehand, or indeed has there ever been afterwards? For an author, it does seem exceptional. I mean, he's larger than Wellington, which I was looking at. Although in Scott's own time, when he was together with Wellington, he compared himself as a jackal to the lion. You know, he was very modest about himself in relation to Wellington, a real hero. But in fact, he ends up with the larger memorial.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think the only comparable example from before the middle of the 19th century is the efforts to memorialise Shakespeare led by David Garrick at the end of the 18th century. And some of you may know that Garrick presides over a kind of Shakespeare Jubilee at Stratford that involves whitewashing the monument to Shakespeare in the church in Stratford-on-Avon. And also erecting other monuments to Shakespeare. And it's then that you get the monument to Shakespeare in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. That, I think, is the biggest kind of coordinated effort to memorialise a writer on this kind of scale. But at this point, at the end of the 18th century, the idea is still connected to a pantheonic structure. We're going to create a Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, and that's going to become the pantheon. the shift that I'm tracing into the 19th century is when we move away from that idea of a building, the Pantheon being a building, towards the Pantheon as an idea distributed across the nation.
Any other questions? Lindsay's sort of positing on. Oh, sorry, no, Lindsay, not a question. I'm not quite there yet. I'm sorry. Sorry. I was just trying to ask if anybody one more question before we move on to the next issues. Yes.
I have climbed it. Yes. Yes. Yes, I did. As Peter said, I've been in Edinburgh for about 3 years, and I started doing some of this research when I lived in Montreal, and the Scott Monument was an awfully long way away. And now I'm here, it looks like I just kind of did it on my way to and from work or something like that, because of course now I see the Scott Monument all the time. So I'm happy to say that as soon as I had the opportunity, I climbed it for myself.
I wonder if we could have a show of hands, and people have been here much longer than I would say getting on for a good third, I would say. Admit to it anyway. Or claim to have done it. Anyway, we'll just move on now, Tom, for a second. Drawing to a close, I'd just like to mention we've got an especially full programme for next year's events, and we hope to get news of these out to you before Christmas this time. Is that still possible, Louise? In the form of the Secretary's letter, which gives details and has a booking form attached to it. This is to allow you to book early in case there isn't enough room later on. So that'll be coming to you soon. I know time is short, but I do think this being the end of a sequence, it's time for us to offer some sort of joint recognition to all the effort that Lee Simpson puts into making these talks possible. I could list the things, but it would take another 15 minutes. So I remember almost every aspect, and it does turn out, though I say it myself, as a class act compared with some of the other societies I've been to. Anyway, the sound, the visuals, and so on, it really is a class act, and we owe that almost entirely to Lee, and I'm very grateful, as everybody else is, I'm sure. We now turn to the ritual giving of gifts to our speaker. They always show the same delights when they are presented to them. And these form Sir Walter, one of the rare Sir Walter Scott Club ties, and one of the rare unsigned copies of a volume of presidential addresses to the Society. Thank you for that, in part recognition for what was a splendid talk. And to finish off, before we go out and have canopies and drinks, and there will be an opportunity then to speak to Tom more directly and personally, I'd like to, at last, I'm sorry about the false gun, ask Lindsay if she could give the vote of thanks on behalf of the Society.
When Peter asked me to give you the vote of thanks, I got to thinking about how strange it was that a man who had so obsessively collected memorabilia himself had then engendered so much. And I was thinking of things like the Corson collection and the endless, I'm sure, representations of the Scott Monument there. And having spent most of my formative years in Edinburgh, I was obviously dominated by the Scott Monument. And at times it's felt that it's been impossible to escape the man, because I remember very much when my day job and my studies were involving Scott, going to Mull for my birthday and literally tripping over a stone which mentioned that he had tried to save a lighthouse there. But the other things that I was remembering was that some years ago, a friend of mine who works in the Central Library had gotten in touch with me and said that they had found some manuscript to do with Scott and a monument. And I thought, oh, well, that's another nice example that I can use when I'm speaking to you. So I got in touch with her, and I said, I think it's something in Malta, isn't it? They were building something in Malta. So she got in touch with me just this afternoon, and she said, no, it's not Malta. It was actually St. Helena. And she said, it's 2 volumes on vellum, and they've been conserved but not catalogued. And then I started to read them, and I was absolutely taken aback, and I hope this is what I think it is, because then I think it'll be a nice surprise for you. So 2 vellum documents from the island of St. Helena 1833, entitled The Abbotsford Subscription. One is decorated with drawings of Abbotsford and images from Scott's books. The text says, "The Abbotsford Subscription, having met with that support which is so deservedly merited, we inhabitants of St. Helena, an island rendered as extraordinary in the political era of 1815 as it became prominent in the eventful life of Napoleon, request that our mote might be added to assist in effecting the great object for which that subscription was set on foot, viz. To leave to after ages a tribute of national feeling for departed worth and of gratitude for the many hours of pleasing and moral instruction which have been afforded to the civilized world by the author of Waverley, and to testify that in our admiration of his talents as a writer and his virtues as a man, we have not been unmindful of our duties as citizens." And the other parchment has 39 signatures and how much money was donated. So I'm hoping that in thanking you for a wonderful speech, I'm also actually introducing you to an object that's not been catalogued that I hope you don't know about, that is now in the Central Library awaiting you. And thank you again for a wonderful talk.